something that, well, it really touches every single one of us who spends any time online. We're looking at data trafficking today, based on the articles and notes you shared with us.
Right, and specifically that really complex relationship between the U.S. and China and how it plays out with our data.
Exactly. Forget the really dry definitions for a moment. What seems to scream out from these sources is that this isn't just about, your personal privacy and isolation.
No, it's bigger.
Yeah.
It's about how the data you generate, often without thinking, is being commercially pulled out, extracted.
And then used to support governments outside the legal systems you thought were actually protecting you.
That's the core of it. It bypasses the safeguards you expect.
So our mission here is to try and untangle this. What is data trafficking, really? How does it work across borders? And maybe most importantly, what are the risks? Not just abstract risks, but tangible ones.
Yeah, for you, for the economy, even for national security, we've got sources covering that Zoom incident involving the Tiananmen commemoration.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And digging into digital sovereignty, the different tech worlds in the U.S. and China. It's quite a picture.
Definitely feels like we might have some aha moments here. Maybe change how you look at your phone a little bit.
Could be. So that definition you mentioned, the sources really try to nail it down. Data trafficking isn't just any data moving.
Right.
It's specifically the commercial extraction, often by companies, of consumer data. But the key is that this extraction ends up supporting a government outside the jurisdiction the user originally consented to operate under.
So it kind of sidesteps the legal framework you thought you were in?
Exactly. It redirects that digital value, your data's value, towards state power somewhere else.
And that's important because it gets easily mixed up with other terms, right? Like data migration.
Yeah, data migration sounds similar, but it's meant to be completely different. Ideally.
How so?
Well, migration is supposed to be planned, procedure-driven. It's legal movement. Think of a company moving data between server locations, but within a clear legal setup.
Like inside the EU, maybe?
Precisely. The sources mention the EU's data adequacy standards or even specific agreements, like the EU-Japan one. Those create a framework for transparent, predictable movement.
Okay, so migration is planned and legal.
But a big issue highlighted in the sources is that, well, neither the US nor China really have the setup for that kind of reliable, transparent data migration between them.
Ah, so the lack of a clear legal path kind of creates murky waters.
Exactly. And that murkiness can help data trafficking happen more easily.
Okay, so migration's one thing. What about data theft? That's obviously different too.
Oh, completely different. Data theft is, well, it's hacking. Straight up.
No pretending it's legal.
Not at all. We've seen those huge examples linked back to China's Ministry of State Security, right? The OPM hack.
Office of Personnel Management, huge.
Anthem Equifax, Marriott.
Oh.
Those were breaches, not some complex arrangement hidden in terms of service.
Okay, so hacking is theft. Trafficking is this commercial extraction supporting a foreign government outside your system. Migration is planned. Legal movement. Got it. But interestingly, you mentioned sources say theft can actually make trafficking more effective. How does that work?
Yeah, they sort of complement each other. Imagine combining data stolen in a hack, maybe government personnel files, with commercially collected data, the stuff gathered through apps and websites via trafficking.
Ah, you could build much richer profiles that way.
Exactly. The stolen data makes the commercially trafficked data more valuable, more useful for intelligence or targeting. They feed the same beast.
It all starts with the data itself. The sources break it down nicely, I thought. Data as the raw material, right?
Yeah, like ingredients, flour, maybe.
Then information is data in context. Flour, eggs, sugar mixed together, now it's telling you something. A recipe.
Right, and then knowledge is that information within a system. Understanding how to bake the cake, the whole process, the science behind it. That jump from raw data to knowledge is where the power really accumulates.
We hear those metaphors all the time. Data is the new oil, data is infrastructure.
And they capture some of the economic value, the security aspect, sure, but they don't quite get at the personal side, the social dynamics, or even just how that data gets generated.
Which brings us to that concept of the labor paradigm, or sometimes playbur.
Yeah, playbur, or the work of being watched. It's this idea that a lot of the data companies vacuum up isn't just passively collected, it's stuff you actively create.
While doing other things. Scrolling social media.
Playing online games, using payment apps, even your smart speaker or robot vacuum listening or mapping your house.
So you think you're just playing or shopping, but you're actually performing unpaid labor.
That's the argument. You're generating the raw material, selling your attention, agreeing, often implicitly, to be watched. And all that data fuels the company's knowledge systems.
Platforms like TikTok are obvious examples.
TikTok, yeah. Fortnite, which is partly owned by Tencent. Venmo or Alipay on the payment side, all those connected devices. Your interactions are the input.
The sources use a really stark example. Revenge porn, to show how fragile our control is.
Right. Sharing a private photo is about trust in a relationship. If your partner shares it non-consensually, that's a violation, a crime. But if a company gets that photo, maybe through its platform, and handles it according to its terms of service, terms that might allow sharing with third parties, or even be subject to foreign government demands.
Suddenly, it's not just a personal betrayal, it's a systemic vulnerability.
Exactly. It shows how corporate data practices, potentially tangled with foreign state interests, can just erode your digital sovereignty. And that hits marginalized groups hardest, often.
And this data, generated through our Playber, becomes valuable when it moves, when it's aggregated, when it's trafficked.
Right. High traffic, lots of data flowing, correlates directly with a company's value. It makes their algorithms better, smarter.
Like TikTok. More users mean more data traffic.
Which trains the algorithm better.
Which attracts more users. It's a feedback loop.
Your scrolling directly fuels their dominance.
Okay, so we know what it is, roughly, and where the data comes from. But who are the big players shaping this? The sources point squarely at the US and China.
It's fascinating. Ideologically, they're worlds apart, right? But the sources argue both systems, in their own ways, end up separating citizens from control over their own data.
How does the US side work, according to these analyses?
Well, the US approach, historically at least, was really driven by wanting rapid tech growth. That whole move fast and break things culture.
Right. Less regulation, let innovation flourish.
Exactly, which led to kind of fragmented rules, limited government oversight compared to the sheer power of the tech corporations themselves.
And that's where surveillance capitalism comes in.
Precisely. Companies like Google, Amazon, Apple, Meta, they build empires on gathering and monetizing vast amounts of user data. Government access, like through FISA warrants, tends to be more case-specific, less of a blanket requirement compared to China.
So the U.S. firms kind of set the global stage for large-scale data collection.
The sources argue they did, yeah. Establishing these exploitative practices as almost the norm. And it creates this situation, some call it digital feudalism, where you're kind of locked into these corporate ecosystems.
And the companies hold all the cards, or rather all the data.
And they guard it pretty closely. Their proprietary data and algorithms makes it hard for users and even regulators to fully grasp what's going on. Advocacy for better protection has been slow. Like climate change, maybe. It's a big, slow-moving problem.
Okay, so that's the U.S. picture. Fragmented, corporate-driven, historically focused on growth. What about China?
China's system is, well, fundamentally different. It's built explicitly on cyber sovereignty or digital sovereignty.
Meaning the state is in charge.
Totally. Formalized state control over the whole digital infrastructure, the tech companies, the data itself. This really solidified around 2010.
And how does that control work in practice?
The government requires companies, doesn't matter if they're Chinese or foreign, to submit to data access demands. They often have to store data locally on servers the state can access. It's just a condition of doing business there.
So cooperate or you can't access their huge market.
Pretty much. And they actively support their own national champions, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, BT firms. They also restrict foreign competition. Think about WeChat effectively replacing platforms like WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger in China.
And this control stops at China's border.
Not entirely. That's a key point. Laws like the Hong Kong National Security Law from 2020 or the 2021 Data Security Law, they have what's called extraterritorial reach.
Meaning they can apply outside China?
Yes. They have these vague penalties which creates a chilling effect. Companies worldwide worry about handling data in a way that might upset Beijing for fear of getting kicked out of the Chinese market.
Wow. And then there's the military link?
Right. The military-civil fusion strategy. It essentially means the government can leverage data, algorithms, AI developed by private companies for state security, intelligence, and military purposes. Blurs the lines completely.
So it's not just what each country does, but how they interact, the collision of these systems.
Exactly. The sources talk about a symbiosis, or maybe even a gridlock between these two approaches. It creates these really complex technopolitical regimes involving the states, the big tech companies, and us, the users.
Companies caught in the middle, like Zoom or Apple.
Yeah, think about them. Huge operations, tons of users in both the US and China. They're constantly trying to balance demands from both sides.
And the incentives are different.
Very different. In the US, powerful tech firms might aim to just meet the minimum legal requirements. But in China, the system is more opaque. The threat of being banned is always there.
So companies might feel pressured to go beyond the minimum requirements for the government there.
That's the argument. To overcomply almost, just to be safe.
And the result of this whole clash, this interaction.
The sources argue it actually weakens digital protections globally. China's state control leverages the massive data pools built up using the US-style collection model. Companies get squeezed by competing demands, and user protection can end up being the lowest priority.
It's important here, the sources mentioned, to be careful about the China threat narrative.
Absolutely. We need to be aware of how that can tap into historical anti-Asian discrimination. It's a real risk in these discussions.
But at the same time, the sources do present evidence of the Chinese government using platforms like WeChat.
Yes, using them to push state narratives, conduct surveillance, censor content, targeting specific groups, Uyghurs, Hong Kong activists, people commemorating Tiananmen, even monitoring Chinese diaspora communities, including Asian Americans in the US.
Which brings us back to that Zoom incident in May 2020. That seems like a perfect case study of this whole dynamic.
It really is. Zoom shut down accounts of activists, including some US-based ones, who were hosting an online event commemorating the Tiananmen Square anniversary. It included participants inside China, like the Tiananmen Mothers Group.
And Zoom's reason?
They said they were complying with local laws in China.
But the US government did get involved.
Sort of. The DOJ charged a former Zoom employee based in China for conspiring to disrupt the meeting and providing user data to Chinese authorities. But Zoom itself, the company, faced no charges in the US related to it.
Which says a lot about maybe their dependence on China.
It highlights it, yeah. They had hundreds of engineers in China. Access to that market is crucial for them. But the bigger picture, the sources suggest, is it just exposed how weak US user data protection can be against foreign government pressure.
And how the US response is often reactive, patchwork, rather than systemic.
Exactly. It happens after something blows up publicly.
Okay, so putting this all together, the definitions, the data origins, the US system, the Chinese system, how they clash, what are the actual concrete risks for you listening? The sources break it down into three levels. First up, personal risk.
Right, privacy violations, surveillance, the obvious stuff.
But it's more than just one app knowing your location, right? It's this mosaic theory.
Yeah, that's the idea. Seemingly harmless bits of info gathered from lots of different places, your shopping habits, your social media posts, maybe data from a breach.
Combine them all.
And you can build a surprisingly detailed, maybe even damaging picture of someone. Remember the story about Target figuring out a teenager was pregnant from her purchases?
Yeah, before her family knew.
Now imagine that kind of analysis power, but combining data from your apps, maybe with data stolen in those big government hacks. You can create incredibly rich profiles.
That's definitely unnerving.
It is. But the sources also suggest that for most individuals, while it's creepy, this personal surveillance might not be the most serious risk compared to the others. Most people aren't high-value intelligence targets individually.
Okay, so what's risk level 2?
Economic. Yes. The threat to economic competitiveness. This is huge because data is the absolute key ingredient for training AI.
Better data, better AI.
Simple as that.
Yeah.
And better AI is the path to long-term dominance in, well, almost every industry.
And Chinese firms get an edge here.
The argument is yes, because their system combines that expansive state control and access to data with the kind of widespread, sometimes exploitative data gathering practices pioneered by US tech giants. They get the best, or maybe the worst, of both worlds.
You see it with TikTok's algorithm or WeChat's reach.
Absolutely. Or look at Tencent in gaming, Ant Group in payments. They're building incredibly sophisticated models of consumer behavior, credit risk. That doesn't just help the companies, it supports China's ambitions in the global financial system, potentially boosting the renminbi.
Even things like smart home devices play into this.
Yeah, if standards are weak, those devices bring data gathering right into your living room, your most private spaces. Data becomes this crucial financial asset and intelligence asset. It's the foundation for future economic power. AI, biotech, you name it.
And that economic competition bleeds into the third risk level, national security.
Directly. It's what some call economic statecraft, using economic muscle, tech dominance for geopolitical goals.
How does that play out?
China's tech sector, fueled by that massive domestic market and data access, becomes a direct counterweight to U.S. influence and their investments in critical infrastructure around the world.
Telecom networks, right? 5G has been a big flashpoint.
Telecom, agriculture technology, smart city projects, even space and satellite data systems. Investing in these creates dependencies. Countries become reliant on technology providers with very close ties to the Chinese state.
And the local data storage requirements we talked about?
That helps blur the lines globally between what's private data in a commercial system and what's effectively a national information resource accessible to Beijing.
Creating opportunities for what?
Spying?
Opportunities for surveillance, certainly maybe targeting specific individuals like U.S. elites, also for spreading disinformation or propaganda through controlled platforms, and for building really detailed models of entire societies.
Models of U.S. communities, their vulnerabilities, their beliefs, health issues, economic weak spots, things U.S. firms probably couldn't model about China due to restrictions there, and refining dual-use tech, VR, AR, AI, using all this data directly boosts military capabilities.
So the mosaic isn't just about individuals anymore, it's about understanding and potentially manipulating entire populations.
That's the national security dimension, yes.
So to kind of wrap this section up, for you, the listener, the takeaway seems to be that your everyday online life, scrolling, gaming, shopping, paying, plugs you into this incredibly complex global system.
A system of data collection, processing, and potential exploitation that crosses borders, involves governments and corporations, and operates largely outside your view or control.
And the risks are real. Personal privacy, economic competition, national security. They're not just future worries, they're happening now and shaping what comes next.
So what does this all really boil down to? We've taken this deep dive looking at your sources and tried to unpack data trafficking. We've seen it's way more complex than just data moving or being stolen.
Right. It's this intricate dance. Corporations, governments, users like you, all caught up in it, fueled by our clicks and scrolls.
And we've seen how the US and Chinese systems, so different on the surface, both end up creating a world where your data is vulnerable. Maybe for commercial profit, maybe for state power, often kind of a mix of both.
And the consequences are tangible. That mosaic theory eroding privacy, the AI race fueled by data impacting economies, and these big national security concerns tied to infrastructure and surveillance.
Yeah, the entanglement, especially between the US and China, built on this foundation of pervasive data gathering in apps and devices. It creates this huge global challenge. Feels incredibly hard to solve.
Which really leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? Thinking about how deeply data gathering is just woven into modern life now, and seeing these powerful, often conflicting interests of governments and corporations. Is it actually possible for us as individuals to genuinely maintain control over our own personal data anymore? Or are we just sort of fundamentally part of this global data ecosystem now, operating way beyond our real consent or maybe even our full understanding? Something to think about next time.